The door does not slam shut the way people imagine. There is no dramatic bang, no violent echo. Instead, it closes with a dull, final sound, heavy metal meeting reinforced concrete. A sound so controlled, so ordinary, that it almost feels polite. But once it locks, everything changes. Inside American prisons, solitary confinement is often described in paperwork as administrative segregation or restrictive housing. Clean words, neutral words, words that hide the reality of what comes next. Because for the person inside the cell, those labels mean one thing: being erased from human contact. The cell is small, smaller than most parking spaces, concrete walls on all sides, a steel door with a narrow slot cut through the center. No window to the outside world. No real sense of time. The air smells faintly of disinfectant and something older, stale sweat, rust, and loneliness that has soaked into the walls over decades. For the next 23 hours, this space will be the entire universe. The first hour doesn't feel like punishment. Not yet. Some inmates even describe an initial sense of relief. No noise from the tier. No threats. No politics. No constant need to stay alert. Just silence. Just stillness. But silence inside solitary confinement is not peaceful. It is aggressive. It presses in from all sides. There is no television in many units. No books beyond what fits through the slot. Meals arrive on plastic trays slid through the door without a word. Sometimes the officer doesn't even look inside. The human exchange lasts less than 3 seconds. Over time, the mind begins to search for stimulation. Anything. The sound of footsteps in the corridor becomes an event. The clank of another door down the range becomes something to focus on. Some inmates pace back and forth for hours, counting steps, just to feel movement. Others lie on the bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories in perfect detail because memory is all that remains. In the United States, tens of thousands of inmates experience this kind of confinement every year. Some for days, others for months, some for years. Officially, solitary confinement is meant to control behavior, to prevent violence, to maintain order. But the experience itself often becomes the most destabilizing force in a prison system already built on control. After several hours, the body begins to react. Without natural light, the circadian rhythm starts to break down. Sleep comes at strange times. Waking feels disorienting. Hunger loses structure. The difference between morning and night blurs until it barely exists. By day 3, many inmates report changes in perception. Sounds feel louder. Thoughts feel sharper and darker. The brain, starved of stimulation, begins creating its own. Some hear voices. Some see movement where there is none. Some feel watched even when the cell is empty. Psychologists have documented this pattern for decades. Isolation disrupts the brain's ability to regulate emotion and reality. In normal life, human interaction acts as an anchor. It reminds the mind what is real. In solitary confinement, that anchor is cut. Inside the cell, there is no mirror. Over time, inmates forget what they look like. Some avoid their own reflection when they catch it in the polished metal of the sink. Others stare too long, trying to confirm they still exist. The most difficult moments often come at night. Prisons never fully sleep. Lights stay on. Doors hum faintly with electrical current. Somewhere down the range, someone might scream, or cry, or laugh uncontrollably. No one knows why. There is no context, just sound floating through concrete. For inmates in solitary confinement, night becomes a psychological battleground. With no distractions left, thoughts turn inward. Regret surfaces. Fear grows louder. The past replays itself in loops that cannot be stopped. This is where time becomes the enemy. An hour feels like a day. A day feels endless. Some inmates scratch calendars into the wall. Others tear threads from their mattress and knot them together, counting days by touch. When those methods fail, they count meals. When that fails, they count breaths. Correctional officers are trained to minimize interaction. It is safer that way. Fewer opportunities for manipulation. Fewer risks. But that distance also reinforces the sense of disappearance. To be unseen, unacknowledged, reduced to a number behind steel. Many inmates say the most painful part of solitary confinement is not the lack of comfort. It is the lack of recognition. No one uses your name. No one asks how you are. No one notices when your voice changes or your posture collapses. You begin to feel like a shadow of a person. Studies in the US have shown that prolonged solitary confinement increases anxiety, depression, and paranoia. Self-harm rates are significantly higher in segregation units than in general population. But numbers only tell part of the story. The real damage is quieter. It is the way inmates stop speaking out loud because there is no one to respond. The way they forget how to hold a conversation. The way eye contact becomes overwhelming after release from the cell. Some inmates fear the moment the door finally opens more than they fear it staying closed. Because after weeks or months alone, the outside world feels too loud, too fast, too alive. When the door opens for the 1 hour of recreation, often alone in another concrete enclosure, the light feels harsh. The space feels unfamiliar. Movement feels awkward. Muscles weaken. Balance shifts. Then the door closes again. Back inside, the silence rushes in like water filling a vacuum. By the end of the first week, many inmates say something inside them changes permanently. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but like erosion, a slow wearing down of identity. You stop thinking about the future. You stop imagining release. You focus only on surviving the next hour, the next meal, the next night. This is not accidental. Solitary confinement, by design, removes autonomy, stimulation, and connection, three things the human brain depends on to function. Without them, the mind begins to turn inward, feeding on itself. And yet, for many inmates in American prisons, this experience is not rare. It is routine. It happens after fights, after accusations, sometimes for protective custody, sometimes for reasons never fully explained. The door closes the same way every time. Quiet, final, unforgiving. And once it does, the countdown begins. Not to freedom, but to the slow unraveling of the human mind. Human beings are not built for isolation. Every part of the brain is shaped by interaction, faces, voices, movement, unpredictability. From childhood onward, the mind learns who it is by reacting to others. Take that away, and something fundamental begins to break. Inside solitary confinement, that process starts quietly. At first, thoughts simply become louder. With no conversations to interrupt them, the internal voice takes center stage. Memories replay with sharper detail. Old arguments resurface. Regrets stretch longer than they ever did on the outside. The mind begins to loop. Psychologists call this cognitive amplification. When external stimulation disappears, internal thoughts expand to fill the space. In a normal environment, the brain constantly shifts attention, sounds, sights, social cues. In isolation, there is nowhere to shift to. So the mind turns inward. In American prisons, mental health staff have long observed the same early signs among inmates placed in solitary confinement. Difficulty concentrating, racing thoughts, sudden mood swings, irritability that appears without warning. These are not signs of weakness. They are predictable neurological responses to deprivation. The brain is an organ that expects input. When it doesn't get it, it improvises. After several days, the sense of time begins to fracture. Without natural light or routine interaction, the brain loses its ability to mark passing hours. Minutes stretch, hours collapse. Some inmates swear days pass without memory. Others feel trapped inside a single moment that never moves forward. Sleep becomes erratic. Some inmates sleep far more than usual, using unconsciousness as escape. Others barely sleep at all. Thoughts race when the lights stay on through the night. The body lies still, but the mind refuses to follow. This lack of rest compounds everything. Without proper sleep, emotional regulation weakens. Small thoughts feel overwhelming. Imagined threats feel real. The line between memory, fear, and reality begins to blur. This is where isolation becomes dangerous, not physically, but psychologically. In the general prison population, inmates learn constant awareness, reading body language, listening for tone, navigating social hierarchies. In solitary confinement, those skills atrophy. There is no feedback, no correction, no reassurance. When human contact disappears, self-perception starts to distort. Some inmates report feeling unreal, as if they are fading. Others describe a growing sense of paranoia, believing they are being watched or judged even when alone. These reactions are well documented in U.S. correctional mental health reports, yet they continue to appear generation after generation. The brain fills the silence with meaning. Sounds become exaggerated. A distant shout echoes like it's right outside the cell. A metal clank feels intentional, personal. Even silence itself begins to feel threatening, as if something bad is about to happen. This constant state of alert exhausts the nervous system. Stress hormones stay elevated. The body never fully relaxes. Over time, anxiety becomes the default setting. The mind stops resting, even when the body does. One of the most disturbing effects of prolonged isolation is how it changes emotional processing. Inmates often describe emotional numbness, an inability to feel joy, sadness, or connection. Others experience sudden emotional surges with no clear cause. Anger appears without warning. Fear spikes in moments that should feel calm. This instability is not random. Emotional regulation depends heavily on social interaction. Facial expressions, tone of voice, and shared experience all help calibrate emotional responses. In solitary confinement, those calibrations disappear. The mind loses its reference points. In some cases, inmates begin talking to themselves out loud, not because they want to, but because silence feels unbearable. Hearing one's own voice becomes proof of existence, a reminder that they are still there. Others retreat completely inward, speaking as little as possible, conserving energy for survival. Both responses are attempts to adapt to an environment that denies normal human needs. Over time, even basic cognitive functions can be affected. Reading becomes difficult. Focus drifts. Thoughts fragment. Tasks that once felt simple, like following a storyline or recalling information, require intense effort. This cognitive decline can persist long after an inmate leaves solitary confinement. And then there is memory. Some inmates report memory gaps, missing days or weeks they cannot account for. Others remember isolation with disturbing clarity, replaying moments again and again long after release. The brain marks the experience as traumatic, storing it differently than ordinary memories. The longer isolation continues, the deeper these changes embed themselves. Mental health professionals working in U.S. prisons often face an impossible contradiction. Solitary confinement is used to manage behavior, yet it frequently worsens the very mental states that lead to rule violations. Anxiety increases. Impulse control weakens. Emotional reactions intensify. A system meant to create control can end up producing instability. For inmates with pre-existing mental health conditions, the effects are even more severe. Isolation removes access to coping mechanisms, routine, conversation, distraction, that help maintain balance. Without them, symptoms escalate. But even inmates with no prior mental health history are not immune. Research has shown that extended isolation can induce symptoms similar to those seen in anxiety disorders, depression, and trauma-related conditions. Again, not because of personal failure, but because the environment overwhelms the brain's capacity to adapt. One of the most misunderstood aspects of solitary confinement is boredom. This is not ordinary boredom. It is not a lack of entertainment. It is a deep neurological deprivation. The brain needs variation, novelty, and challenge. Without them, it begins to shut down certain functions while overactivating others. Imagination becomes both refuge and enemy. Some inmates create elaborate mental routines, replaying movies from memory, designing imaginary homes, holding conversations that never happen. These mental constructions can provide temporary relief, but they also blur the boundary between thought and reality. Others fixate on tiny details, the crack in the wall, the sound of air moving through vents, until those details take on outsized importance. Attention narrows. Perspective collapses. This narrowing is a survival response. In isolation, the brain prioritizes immediate awareness over long-term planning. The future becomes abstract. The past becomes intrusive. The present stretches endlessly. Hope becomes fragile. When days feel identical, motivation erodes. Without progress markers or social reinforcement, effort feels meaningless. This is one reason why some inmates describe solitary confinement as worse than physical hardship. It attacks purpose itself, and yet, the environment demands compliance. Inmates must follow rules precisely. Minor infractions can extend isolation time. This creates a constant tension, mental strain combined with the pressure of perfect behavior. For a mind already under stress, this can feel impossible. Officers working these units often notice the change before anyone else. Voices grow flat. Eye contact disappears. Movements slow or become restless. The person inside the cell is still alive, but something essential is slipping away. What makes this especially troubling is that many inmates placed in solitary confinement are eventually returned to the general population or released back into society. They do not leave unchanged. Reintegration is often jarring. Noise feels overwhelming. Crowds trigger anxiety. Normal conversation feels exhausting. Trust becomes difficult. The skills lost in isolation do not return instantly. The mind adapts to survive solitude, then struggles to adapt back. This raises uncomfortable questions about the long-term impact of solitary confinement, not just on inmates, but on the systems that rely on it. A punishment designed for control may produce outcomes that ripple far beyond the cell. And still, the practice continues. Not because the damage is unknown, but because the damage is quiet. There are no visible scars, no immediate headlines, just slow psychological erosion happening behind locked doors. By the time the door finally opens, the mind inside may no longer resemble the one that entered. And in the next chapter, we'll explore what happens when isolation stretches from days into months, and sometimes years, and why some inmates say that time itself becomes the most powerful weapon of all. Time behaves differently inside solitary confinement. It does not move forward in a straight line. It stretches, collapses, and repeats itself until days lose their meaning. What begins as a short disciplinary measure can quietly turn into something much longer, something that reshapes a person's relationship with reality itself. In American prisons, some inmates enter solitary confinement believing it will last a few days. Others are told weeks. But paperwork changes. Reviews are delayed. Infractions, sometimes minor, sometimes misunderstood, reset the clock. Before the inmate fully realizes it, the isolation has stretched from days into months. And for some, months become years. There is a moment inmates often describe when they stop asking how long they have left. Not because they know the answer, but because the question itself becomes unbearable. Hope, once repeatedly disappointed, begins to feel dangerous. It is safer not to expect anything at all. This is where time becomes a weapon. In the early stages of isolation, inmates mark the days obsessively. Scratches on the wall, numbers written on scraps of paper, mental calendars reviewed again and again. Time feels slow, but it still exists. As isolation continues, that structure erodes. Days begin to blend together. Without change, the brain stops distinguishing one from another. Memory loses sequence. Events no longer have a clear order. Some inmates recall entire months as a single blur, unable to separate one day from the next. This loss of temporal awareness has profound psychological effects. The human brain relies on progression, before and after, cause and effect. When time stops feeling linear, identity begins to fracture. Who you were yesterday no longer feels connected to who you are today. The future feels abstract, almost imaginary. This disconnection weakens motivation. Why plan when nothing changes? Why imagine tomorrow when today never ends? Inside long-term solitary confinement, survival becomes about endurance, not growth. The goal is not improvement or rehabilitation. It is simply getting through the next hour without unraveling. For many inmates, routines become lifelines. They wake at the same time, pace the same number of steps, eat meals in the same order, lie on the bunk at the same angle. These rituals provide a sense of control in an environment designed to remove it. Even small disruptions can feel deeply unsettling. When routines break, anxiety spikes. A delayed meal, a missed recreation hour, an unexpected noise. In a world already stripped to its bare minimum, unpredictability feels threatening. The mind clings to sameness as protection. As months pass, physical changes begin to appear. Muscle tone weakens from lack of movement. Posture shifts. Eyes grow sensitive to light. The body adapts to stillness in ways that make movement feel foreign. Even simple actions, standing quickly, walking in open space, can feel disorienting. These physical changes reinforce the psychological ones. When the body feels weaker, the mind often follows. Extended isolation also alters how inmates experience social connection, even in memory. Faces become harder to recall. Voices fade. Relationships feel distant, unreal, like scenes from a movie rather than parts of a real life. Some inmates deliberately avoid thinking about loved ones. Not because they don't care, but because remembering connection makes isolation hurt more. Emotional numbness becomes a form of self-defense. Others hold on too tightly, replaying conversations and memories until they feel almost present. But this can be equally dangerous, blurring the line between imagination and reality. Over time, the mind adapts to solitude in ways that are difficult to reverse. Social instincts dull, humor disappears, empathy narrows, not out of cruelty, but because there is no one to practice it with. Emotional responses flatten, conserving energy for survival. This is not rehabilitation. It is containment. Correctional systems often justify long-term solitary confinement as necessary for safety. Certain inmates are considered too dangerous, too disruptive, or too vulnerable for general population. But the longer isolation continues, the harder reintegration becomes. The very behavior solitary confinement is meant to control can intensify under its effects. Frustration grows. Tolerance shrinks. Emotional regulation weakens. When interaction finally occurs, reactions can be extreme, not because of intent, but because the mind has lost its balance. Mental health staff face a difficult reality. They may recognize the harm caused by extended isolation, but their authority is limited. Decisions are often administrative, based on security classifications rather than psychological readiness. Treatment options inside solitary units are minimal by design. A brief check at the door, a question shouted through metal, a clipboard note. Meaningful therapy requires trust and conversation, both nearly impossible in an environment built on separation. As months turn into years, identity erodes further. Some inmates describe feeling frozen in time, as if their life stopped the moment the door closed. The outside world moves on without them. Technology changes. Culture shifts. People age. Inside the cell, nothing moves. This creates a painful dislocation. When inmates imagine release, they often feel fear rather than relief. The world they remember no longer exists. The person they were no longer feels accessible. Isolation has changed how they think, react, and perceive danger. This fear is not irrational. Formerly isolated inmates often struggle deeply when returned to normal environments. Overstimulation overwhelms the senses. Noise triggers anxiety. Crowds feel threatening. Simple decisions feel impossible. What solitary confinement takes away, it does not easily give back. And yet, some inmates remain in these conditions for astonishing lengths of time. Years spent alone with minimal human contact. Years of routine, silence, and internal survival. The question becomes unavoidable. What does that do to a person? Not just while they are inside the cell, but afterward. The psychological effects do not disappear when the door opens. The mind has adapted to survive isolation. Undoing that adaptation takes time, support, and patience, resources often in short supply. Without proper transition, inmates may feel alienated, misunderstood, and overwhelmed. Social cues feel confusing. Trust feels risky. Emotional expression feels dangerous. Isolation teaches one lesson very well. Reliance on others is unsafe. This belief can persist long after confinement ends. From a broader perspective, long-term solitary confinement raises difficult ethical and practical questions. A system designed to manage risk may be creating new risks, ones that extend beyond prison walls. Communities receive individuals who have spent years without normal human interaction. Expectations of immediate adjustment ignore the reality of psychological conditioning. The damage is not visible, but it is real. By the time an inmate has spent years in solitary confinement, the cell is no longer just a place. It becomes a mental state, a way of existing that lingers even in freedom. And in the next chapter, we'll examine why solitary confinement continues despite what we know, exploring the systems, decisions, and pressures that keep this practice alive inside American prisons. By now, the damage caused by solitary confinement is not a mystery. Psychologists, correctional experts, and even prison officials themselves have acknowledged its effects for decades. Reports have been written, studies published, court cases argued. And yet, across the United States, solitary confinement remains deeply embedded in the prison system. To understand why, you have to look beyond the cell and into the structure that surrounds it. American prisons are built on control. Every movement, every interaction, every privilege is regulated. In environments where violence is a constant possibility and resources are stretched thin, control becomes the primary currency. Solitary confinement offers something administrators value above almost everything else: immediate compliance. When an inmate is isolated, the risk to others drops instantly. There are no fights in an empty cell, no group dynamics to manage, no alliances forming. From a purely operational standpoint, solitary confinement works fast. That speed is part of its appeal. In overcrowded facilities, staff shortages are common. Officers are responsible for hundreds of inmates at a time. Mental health professionals are often overwhelmed. Programs designed for rehabilitation compete with security concerns for funding and attention. In this context, solitary confinement becomes a blunt but effective tool. It does not require extra staff. It does not require trust. It does not require long-term planning. It simply removes the problem from view. This removal creates the illusion of resolution. But illusions have consequences. Many inmates placed in solitary confinement are not there for extreme violence. Some are isolated for rule violations that would seem minor outside prison walls: talking back, refusing orders, possessing unauthorized items. Others are placed there for protective reasons, not punishment at all. Protective custody often mirrors solitary confinement almost exactly. The logic is simple. Separation keeps people safe. But safety achieved through isolation still carries the same psychological cost. Once an inmate enters the system of segregation, getting out can be far more difficult than getting in. Classification reviews are often delayed. Decisions rely on reports written by staff who may never speak directly with the inmate. Behavioral expectations are strict, yet the environment itself makes compliance harder. Anxiety, irritability, and emotional instability caused by isolation can lead to infractions that extend confinement. The cycle feeds itself. From the administrative side, solitary confinement is often framed as temporary, a holding space, a necessary pause. But for the person inside, time stretches unpredictably. Days turn into months with no clear explanation. Transparency disappears. This lack of clarity is itself destabilizing. When inmates do not understand why they are confined or how to earn release, helplessness grows. Motivation fades. Trust erodes. The system becomes something that happens to them, not something they can navigate. Correctional officers working segregation units face their own pressures. They operate in environments designed for separation, not communication. Interactions are brief, procedural, and often tense. Emotional distance becomes a survival mechanism. Over time, isolation affects not just inmates, but the staff who work around it. Burnout is common. When exposure to distress becomes routine, empathy can erode. Not because officers don't care, but because caring constantly in such conditions is exhausting. Emotional detachment becomes protection. This emotional gap reinforces the isolation already built into the system. From a policy standpoint, reforms move slowly. Prisons are political spaces. Decisions about funding, staffing, and reform are influenced by public opinion, legislation, and budget constraints. Solitary confinement does not happen in a vacuum. It exists within a broader cultural framework that emphasizes punishment over rehabilitation. Public perception plays a powerful role. Many people outside prison walls believe solitary confinement is reserved for the worst of the worst. Dangerous individuals. Extreme cases. This belief makes the practice easier to accept, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Complex realities are reduced to simple narratives. The truth is more complicated. Solitary confinement often becomes a default solution when other systems fail. When mental health care is insufficient. When overcrowding overwhelms staff. When conflict resolution resources are lacking. Instead of addressing root causes, isolation manages symptoms. This approach may stabilize a facility temporarily, but it does not address long-term outcomes. In fact, it can worsen them. Inmates emerging from solitary confinement often return to general population less equipped to handle social interaction. Tension increases. Misunderstandings escalate. The very behavior isolation was meant to prevent becomes more likely. From a systems perspective, this is a paradox. A tool designed to create order may be quietly undermining it. Legal challenges have attempted to address these contradictions. Courts have questioned the use of prolonged solitary confinement, especially for vulnerable populations. Some states have introduced reforms, limiting the duration or expanding oversight. But implementation varies widely. What exists on paper does not always translate into practice. Policies depend on enforcement, resources, and institutional culture. Change inside large systems is slow, uneven, and often resistant. For prison administrators, the risk of abandoning solitary confinement entirely feels high. Alternatives require investment, more staff, better training, expanded mental health services, and new approaches to conflict management. These solutions take time. They demand patience in environments where immediate control is often prioritized. So the door stays closed, not always out of cruelty, often out of habit, sometimes out of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of violence, fear of change. But the cost of that fear is carried by the people inside the cells. As awareness grows, the conversation around solitary confinement continues to shift. Advocacy groups, researchers, and former inmates have brought attention to the human impact of prolonged isolation. Stories once hidden are now part of public discourse. Still, progress remains uneven. Some facilities reduce their reliance on isolation. Others continue unchanged. The system, like the inmates it contains, struggles to adapt. What makes solitary confinement especially troubling is how quietly it operates. There are no public audiences, no visible moments, just routine decisions made behind reinforced doors. The effects unfold slowly, out of sight. And by the time an inmate leaves solitary confinement, whether into general population or back into society, the damage may already be done. The system may consider the problem solved. The person inside knows otherwise. In the final chapter, we'll look at what happens after the door opens, how inmates attempt to rebuild themselves, what recovery really looks like, and whether isolation ever truly ends. When the door finally opens, it does not feel like freedom. It feels unfamiliar. For months, sometimes years, the cell has been the entire world. Its walls define space. Its silence defined time. Its routines defined reality. When that door unlocks, the mind does not immediately celebrate. It hesitates. Movement feels strange. Light feels too bright. Sound feels too loud. The body steps forward, but the mind lags behind. Formerly isolated inmates often describe this moment as disorienting rather than joyful. The world beyond the cell feels too fast, too chaotic, too alive. After long periods of stillness, even normal motion feels overwhelming. The nervous system, conditioned to silence and control, struggles to adapt. This is where the true aftermath of solitary confinement begins. Reentry into general population or society is not a simple transition. The mind has learned a new way of existing, one shaped by isolation, hyperawareness, and emotional containment. Those adaptations do not disappear just because the door opens. Noise becomes a trigger. Crowds feel threatening. Eye contact feels invasive. Conversation feels exhausting. What once felt normal now feels intense. For many inmates, social interaction becomes a source of anxiety rather than comfort. The skills that make relationships possible, reading expressions, managing tone, interpreting intention, have weakened from disuse. Trust feels risky. Vulnerability feels dangerous. Connection feels unfamiliar. Some withdraw inward, staying quiet and distant. Others become overwhelmed by stimulation, reacting strongly to small stresses. Neither response is chosen consciously. Both are learned adaptations. The mind learned to survive in silence. Now it must learn to live in noise. This transition is rarely supported properly. Mental health services in many systems are limited. Follow-up care is inconsistent. Counseling, when available, is often short-term and under-resourced. Inmates are expected to adjust without being given the tools to do so. Recovery becomes an individual burden. Some former inmates describe feeling emotionally numb long after release from isolation. Joy feels distant. Excitement feels foreign. Even sadness feels muted. Emotional flattening, once a survival strategy, becomes a barrier to normal life. Others experience the opposite, intense emotional surges that feel uncontrollable. Anger, fear, and panic appear without warning. The nervous system remains in survival mode, even in safe environments. This is the long shadow of isolation. It follows people beyond prison walls, beyond locked doors, beyond steel and concrete. In everyday life, these invisible effects create real challenges. Holding conversations, maintaining relationships, managing conflict, navigating stress, all become harder when the mind has been conditioned for solitude and threat. Some former inmates struggle with simple choices. In solitary confinement, decisions are made for you: when to eat, when to sleep, when to move. Autonomy disappears. When it returns, it feels overwhelming. Freedom requires responsibility. Responsibility requires confidence. Confidence often takes time to rebuild. Without support, many people fall into cycles of isolation even outside prison, avoiding social spaces, withdrawing from others, living emotionally confined even in physical freedom. The cell becomes internal. This is perhaps the most haunting legacy of solitary confinement, the way it continues even when the walls are gone. Recovery, when it happens, is slow. It happens through patience, through therapy, through rebuilding trust, through relearning connection, through safe relationships, through stability. But not everyone has access to these things. Not everyone receives help. Not everyone heals. And yet, some do. Some former inmates rebuild their lives. They learn to tolerate noise again. They learn to trust again. They learn to connect again. They learn to feel again. Their recovery is not fast, and it is not linear, but it is possible. This is an important truth. The human mind is fragile, but it is also resilient. It adapts to survive isolation. And with support, it can adapt again to live in connection. But adaptation leaves marks. Scars that cannot be seen. Habits that cannot be erased overnight. Memories that return in silence. This is why solitary confinement cannot be understood as a temporary punishment. It is a psychological experience that reshapes perception, identity, and emotion. It changes how a person experiences the world. It changes how they experience themselves. For the system, solitary confinement may be a management tool. For the person inside the cell, it is a life-altering environment. This difference in perspective defines the entire issue. From the outside, it looks like control. From the inside, it feels like erasure. The conversation around solitary confinement is still evolving. Some systems are changing. Some policies are shifting. Some reforms are emerging. But the practice remains widespread. The doors still close. The lights still stay on. The silence still fills the cells. And inside those cells, minds are still adapting to survive. What this documentary reveals is not just a prison practice. It is a human story. A story about isolation, about identity, about survival, about the mind's limits, and about what happens when human beings are separated from the one thing they need most to remain whole: other people. Solitary confinement does not just remove freedom. It removes connection. It removes recognition. It removes voice. And when those things are taken away, something deeper is lost. Not instantly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, day by day, thought by thought, until the person inside the cell becomes someone else. When the door opens, the body may walk out, but the mind takes longer, sometimes much longer, sometimes forever. This is the reality behind the walls. Not the myths, not the stereotypes, not the headlines, but the silent psychological truth of isolation. A truth that continues long after the door unlocks, long after the lights change, long after the cell is empty, because solitary confinement does not always end when the confinement ends. Sometimes, it follows the person out. And that is the part no one sees.